Our subject this evening will be events of the 7th, 8th, and even into the 9th centuries, and not in one place exclusively. We're going to begin with a brief overview of the Christian world in the latter part of the 7th century, and then we will, of course, have to focus on the last crisis, certainly not the last crisis of the Church. The Church is always in crisis until the end of the world. If we have managed to say nothing so far in these talks, we certainly have said that. But the last of what is called the great Christological crises, the dispute and division that happened over the person of Christ, the articulation of the doctrine of the person of Christ. And this last one is iconoclasm. So we'll deal with iconoclasm and the 7th Ecumenical Council. But first of all, if we were to just take a quick bird's eye view over the Christian world in the last part of the 7th century, and instead of, as we usually do, starting east, let's start from the west this time, and focus on a few places. First of all, England at this time, the churches of England and Ireland are having what perhaps could be called the closest to a golden age that the church can ever said to be having. There is great flourishing both of the life of the churches and of monastic life, great missionary activity, such great missionaries that we spoke of in the last talk, St. Boniface, St. Aidan, great monastic saints such as St. Cuthbert and St. Hilda, the abbess of Whitby. This is the time when St. Bede is writing his history of the English people. Irish missionaries are going practically all over the known Christian world, spreading the faith. So there is a great blossoming there going on in England and Ireland. It's not going to last too long. It's going to last for a while, for a century and a half or so, and then the Danes are going to come burning and pillaging. Going south to Spain, things are not good in Spain as far as external conditions go. Of course, the Muslim advance has come that far, and Spain has been overrun by the Muslims, and the Christians, formerly Visigothic Christian kingdom of Spain, flees to the northern recesses in the mountains there in what, if you looked at a modern map of Spain, would be the provinces of Leon and Asturias and Galicia, northern Spain. And even there, they continue for several centuries in great hardship, maintaining their faith. This, on the other hand, is a glorious age in Spain, because where there is persecution, there are also martyrs, and there are many who shed their blood for Christ rather than apostatize and embrace Islam in Spain in the 8th century and following. Up in what is today France, but of course France and Germany and Italy as the modern nation states that they are, don't exist at this time and will not exist for a long time. Rather, there is still a great deal of tribal warfare going on. There are many small states, but gradually the ascendancy of the Frankish people, the Germanic Frankish people from which modern France has its name, they begin to centralize their power. First under King Clovis, the king of the Franks, who embraces Orthodox Christianity, and then his entire people. And then by the year 800, of course, and we're going to talk about this later on this evening and also next in the next talk, the greatest of the Frankish emperors, the Emperor Charlemagne, will in fact become, at least in Western eyes, what has not existed in the West since the fall of the Western Roman Emperor, will become Emperor of the West. And as we will see, this will be at a price of considerable strife over this issue between East and West. As we had for the moment, we'll skip over the Greek world because we're going to have to land back there in a minute and spend, as usual, a good bit of time there. But going further east, of course, the great churches of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, and North Africa are also all under Muslim rule. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa have all fallen to the Muslims. There is not so much a wave, after the initial conquest, there is not so much a vicious persecution that goes on. Although there are instances of it, and it sporadically flares up, depending on the temperament of the Muslim ruler, the caliph. Generally, the Christians who are, according to the Quran, the sacred book of the Muslims, regarded as people of the book, like the Jews, people of the scriptures, although certainly the Muslims reject the core of the New Testament. Nevertheless, strictly speaking, according to the Quran, the Christians were to be treated with toleration as long as they did not get in the way of Islam and did not try to convince Muslims to embrace Christianity. And because, of course, it is the Christian population of Egypt and Syria, primarily, that is the learned class. They quickly rise to rather high places in the Muslim courts. They are the teachers, the physicians, the lawyers. So although we no longer have the Christian state there in Egypt or the Near East, nevertheless, the Christian population remains in most parts of that area, in the majority. Now, if we go to the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire as we know it now, we concluded the last talk with speaking of St. Maximus the Confessor and his defense of the doctrine of the Church against those who denied the human will of Christ, the monothelites, as they are called. And you will recall that this was yet another attempt, false attempt, because it ignored the real differences that did exist, false attempt to unite the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians, or the Monophysites. And of course this had political ramifications, that the Byzantine Empire, that of course also feared the onslaughts of Islam, particularly the emperor and the military. The emperor and the military are going to be mentioned continually as we go along this evening. Wanted there not to be these divisions in doctrine that created not simply a kind of isolated religious dispute, but affected the whole life of the empire. So they tried to come up with these various formulations that they hoped would pacify everyone, and they did not work because they ignored the fact that there were real issues of doctrine and truth, in this case the fullness of the humanity of Christ, at stake in denying that Christ had a human will. And we spoke how St. Maximus suffered and died along with St. Martin, the Pope of Rome, in defense of the doctrine of the fullness of the two natures of Christ. So shortly after that time, we have the Sixth Ecumenical Council convene, and we don't have to say too much about that. It's the third Council of Constantinople that meets in the years 680 and 81. And what this council does, purely and simply, is it vindicates St. Maximus the Confessor, and anathematizes, declares to be false teaching those who denied that Christ had two wills, those who denied the human will in Christ. And specifically, among those whom it anathematized as heretics were both the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome, previous to Pope St. Martin, Pope Honorius of Rome, and Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, who both signed this statement that Christ has no human will, and they were both condemned as heretics. So this is the first time that a Pope of Rome, Bishop of Rome, has been accused and convicted of heresy. But indeed, Pope Honorius of Rome was a monothelite and was condemned as such by the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Now, neither the Fifth nor the Sixth Ecumenical Council came up with any canonical legislation. There are no canons of the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils. The reason for that is that those two councils dealt exclusively with these issues regarding the person of Christ, the two natures and the two wills. But there was a great need to continually take care of questions of order in the church. So toward the close of the 7th century, there is another council that meets, and it's an important one because it put in their final form many of much of the canonical legislation that affects Orthodox Church life up to our own time. And this is called the Council of Trullo. Trullo means the dome, and the reason why that word was used is it was held in the domed hall in Constantinople in the year 692. And although the Council of Trullo is not one of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, yet all of the canons of the Council of Trullo are treated as canons of an ecumenical council, and that's why the Council of Trullo is sometimes called the Quinisext Council. That means the fifth, sixth council, meaning as a extension of the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils. And so here's a sampling of some of the canons of the Council of Trullo. They regulated questions regarding the marriage of clergy, that they affirmed the traditional practice of the church that married men could be ordained to the diaconate and to the priesthood, but that if someone was ordained as a celibate, they could not marry, they must remain celibate. This to preserve the stability of life, which is central requirement for someone who presents himself for ordination. Likewise, they reaffirmed a decision of the earlier council regarding the age that it was necessary to be ordained. That, for example, one should have attained the age of 30, the age of the Lord at his baptism, before one could be ordained a priest. It regulated the traditions and practices of fasting that had become common in the church, particularly in regard to the way Lent was to be kept, the way the Lenten fast and abstinence was to be observed. There's a rather amusingly expressed canon there. They begin in the usual way. It has come to our attention that some people, especially they say toward the Armenian areas, having had the traditional description that the Saturdays and Sundays of the Great Lent are not fast days, that they have therefore observed these days with the eating of eggs and dairy products and such things. And so they make it clear that that's not the kind of fasting that was being talked about, that the distinction between Saturday and Sunday was that people were not required to fast all day, as they were expected to do on the weekdays of Lent, to not eat anything at all day. Rather, on Saturday and Sunday, the liturgy was celebrated in the morning, and then one could eat the usual amount of meals, but nevertheless, the abstinence from the Lent and from the foods that were abstained from in Lent was to remain in force through the whole season. That's an example. The Council of Trullo prescribed that the liturgy of the presanctified gifts was to be celebrated on the weekdays of Lent, in order that the faithful who were fasting could be nourished by the Holy Eucharist, and yet could be nourished by the Holy Eucharist in such a way that was not expressed through the actual celebration of the Eucharistic liturgy, which is the feast of the Church and regarded as incompatible with the spirit of a fasting day. So the Trullo Council prescribed that the body and blood of Christ were to be reserved from the Sunday liturgy and distributed in the evening. At this time, by the way, not only on Wednesday and Friday, but from Monday through Friday on all the weekdays of Lent. It reaffirmed some legislation that came from the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, that we do not kneel for prayers on Sunday, that there should be no mixed marriages between the Orthodox and the heterodox. Another interesting one of the first times that church music is mentioned in the canons of the Church. It said, without becoming too specific, so we don't know exactly what they meant, that unsuitable music was not to be used in the church services. The only elaboration that is given on what unsuitable music is described as undisciplined vociferations, are not to be heard in the churches. Also, two very important canons from the first, not only the First Ecumenical Council, but even from the apostolic period, that those who procure abortions, or those who assist in abortions, or those who give drugs for abortions are indeed guilty of murder and are excommunicated. Also, a reaffirmation of the centrality of the necessity of the presence of Christians at the Sunday liturgy. The First Ecumenical Council had declared that if someone absents themselves from the Sunday liturgy for 3 weeks without a reason worthy of a blessing, they are to be excommunicated for a period of time until they show repentance and do not hold the Lord's body in contempt, it says. So that council tries to even out irregularities that had entered into the day-by-day life of the Church, the Council of Trullo. Then, now, before we go on into the 8th century, we should also mention, just in passing, how things are in Rome itself, or in Italy, as it is known today. And there is no let-up in the continual invasions of this or that people, Lombards, and even threats from the Muslims. The Muslims themselves sack Rome in the 8th century. The condition of the city of Rome, because of these continual attacks, is really quite lamentable. I don't recall but I don't think I did. Read the words of St Gregory the Great at the beginning of the 7th century, who describes the state of the city as terrible. He says, where is the Senate? Where are the people? Destruction everywhere, sickness and death, no government. No. He himself had to put together a program of relief for feeding the poor. It is from this period, from actually before the 8th century, but for a number of centuries, ever since the empire fell in Rome, that the Pope, and I think it's fair to say, pretty much by default, finds himself not only the bishop, but also the governor of the city of Rome. He is responsible for the church, and he's responsible, we can't say for the state, because that presumes a notion of the state that didn't exist then. But he is responsible for the economic welfare of the people. So this combination of what we would call, I don't think they would call it this at that time, but what we would call spiritual and secular responsibility being combined in the Roman Pope. It goes on for a number of centuries there. And of course, this is in great contrast to what's going on in Constantinople and in the Byzantine Empire, because although there is what is to be called later, what the Greeks like to describe the ideal situation of what we would call church and state as a symphony. The Patriarch and the Emperor are in symphony together. Well, the symphony has some sour notes sometimes. Lots of them, as we're going to see going on. But never is the Patriarch of Constantinople or the bishops of the Greek Church, they are never responsible for, dealing with invading armies or being responsible for the law courts or anything like that, as they are, as the Pope and the clergy are in Rome. There is no other government practically for periods of time, except when this or that barbarian king or chieftain sets himself up, but it's always on a very temporary basis. So the position of the papacy is the one place of permanence to be found there in Rome. However, if you were to ask any of the popes of that period, 6th, 7th, 8th century, if you were to ask them the question, are you a subject of anyone? That would be a kind of question of the time. They would say yes. They would say, I am a subject of the emperor in Constantinople. Everybody is. They still acknowledged that the emperor in Constantinople had what we would call political authority over not only the Greek world, but what was still very much acknowledged, at least by the Romans, as the Roman world also. It's just that how much the emperor in Constantinople could do or would do to help the lot of the people particularly in Italy was well, not much. So we have, in fact, before we go on, Pope St Gregory the Great, before he became Pope in Rome, was the ambassador to the Emperor of Constantinople. He lived in Constantinople for many years, hated it. He thought that he disliked the kind of flowery language and elaborate court ceremonial of the Greeks. It was during the time of Pope Gregory that the Patriarch of Constantinople first begins to call himself the Ecumenical Patriarch. And St. Gregory, who was Pope by this time in Rome, thought that was a very ostentatious title. And so, to give example, when he gave himself a title, called himself the servant of the servants of God. That remains one of the titles of the Pope to this day, Servus Servorum Dei. And he wrote a letter to both the bishops of Constantinople and Alexandria, away with these ostentatious titles. But part of it was based on an understanding. See, in the Greek understanding, the word ecumenical didn't have the same sound as it did to the Latins. For them, it was making some sort of universal claim. But ecumenical in Greek just means the ecumeni is the empire. So what's ecumenical is focused on the chief city of the empire, which was Constantinople. For example, the chief librarian of Constantinople called himself the ecumenical librarian. So it wasn't that big a deal for the bishop of Constantinople to call himself ecumenical patriarch, but Pope Gregory did not like it. Okay, in the 8th century, a tremendous controversy brews up again in the church. And of course, to those who have some familiarity with church history, the iconoclast controversy is nothing new. However, in describing the rise of iconoclasm and its eventual defeat tonight, first of all, it's necessary to bear in mind that this controversy takes a long time to resolve itself. It's going to go about a century and a half into the middle of the 9th century. You could say, if you want precise years, from the year 726 to 843, so about a century and a couple decades. And it is, as are most of these things, a rather complex phenomenon. Sometimes it's presented in a rather simplistic way, that it was a controversy between those who wanted to get rid of images in the churches and those who upheld them, and that was indeed its most obvious external expression. But as is usually the case, below the surface, there was a lot more to it than that. Both theological and political. The attempt, the arising of iconoclasm began with a series of emperors, a new dynasty of emperors in Constantinople that began with Emperor Leo V. And these emperors were from further east. They were not Greeks. They were some of them Syrians, some of them Armenians. So a new Isaurian, from an area of Syria or Armenian dynasty come. So it is these emperors who desire to have, and this is what I'd like to impress on you this evening, who desire to have complete control of the church. They wish to have the church function. It's one of the first attempts, in some ways, of what's going to happen in many places, particularly throughout the Western world, almost 1,000 years later. They wish to have the church function as an arm of the state, but over which the emperor has ultimate authority. In order for this to happen, the emperor must do two things. First of all, he must have the obedience of the bishops and the patriarch. And secondly, he must have the obedience of what at this time is the most influential force in the church, and that is the monks. And the battleground over which this, as an overall statement before we start discussing iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is an effort by the Byzantine emperors, by the emperors of Constantinople, to crush the influence of the monks, and the issue that is used is the issue of the veneration of the icons. Now, in the year 726, Emperor Leo V publishes an edict that all of the icons, whether they are in the churches or in public buildings or even in the homes of the faithful, must be removed. Now, where has this come from? Has it come from nowhere? The roots of iconoclasm can be found in a number of sources, and perhaps we need to digress for a few moments and briefly overview the history of the use of art and images in the church. We know that from the earliest days of the church there has been Christian art. It's found everywhere. It's mentioned by some of the earliest Christian writers. Much of it involves the use of symbols, whether it's the fish or sometimes such animal symbols such as the lamb or the peacock or the phoenix, the mythical bird that is consumed and then rises. Sometimes even the butterfly, the anchor, the sign of hope. And then increasingly, once the persecution ends, of the cross itself, though the cross is not used so much by the earliest Christians because it's seemingly because it's a sort of dead giveaway in the time when most of their activity had to be secret. Then, in addition to this symbolic art, there is painting. And the paintings are found, first of all, not so much in church buildings, because there aren't too many church buildings around except for the house churches and what was able to be done with those structures themselves. It's not so much is known about that. But in the catacombs, the catacomb art, we find a great variety of use, particularly of scenes from the scriptures, both from the Old and New Testaments. And the favorites seem to be such things as Daniel in the lion's den and the three young men in the fiery furnace. One finds those most of all. Sometimes Moses dividing the Red Sea. And then in the New Testament, scenes from the life of Christ, especially such things as the raising of Lazarus, the miracles, the calming of the sea is, in fact, in our church here we have two of the most common depictions, the raising of Lazarus and the calming of the sea by Christ. These pictures of the miracles. Very frequently also in early Christian art, Christ is depicted not as a mature, in the sense of worldly time, not as a mature man, but as a youth without a beard, sometimes shining like a sunburst, as an attempt to depict the eternal glory and youthfulness of the risen Lord. So there's a great deal of what we would call symbolic art there. Now, we have a very interesting thing in one of the earliest church buildings known on the Euphrates River in a town called Dura. There is, dating from the 2nd to 3rd centuries, which is very early, both a Christian church and a synagogue. And both of them are completely covered with paintings, and it's especially unusual for the synagogue to have these paintings of the Old Testament. And it's proof that even the Jews did not, at least some of the Jews in some places, did not regard the prohibition of images in the second commandment to be an absolute one, because here we have a synagogue, a large one, by the way, a large, wealthy synagogue, covered with scenes from the Old Testament. When the persecutions end and the Christians begin to build churches, the use of iconography, particularly in the form of mosaic, becomes common everywhere in the Greek and Roman world. Not so common further east. Not so common in Egypt. Not so common in Armenia. Not so common in Syria and Palestine. Now, why is that? The Greco-Roman world had a long cultural tradition of art, statuary. The church, for the most part, I think we could say universally, was not about to embrace the kind of statues of the style of statues that Greek and Roman art used to display their gods, the three-dimensional statue. But this deeply ingrained consciousness of using artistic means to depict the mysteries of faith in the Greek and Latin Christians was almost instinctive. And they very quickly, although rejecting, for the most part, the three-dimensional image, came up with the two-dimensional image. And so iconography, both in the ancient churches of Rome and all through the Greek world, is found universally. But it's not found so much further east. And that is because these people, the Armenians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, are Semites culturally. They are of the same stock as the Jews themselves. They do not have, it's not the Jews alone, but it's also the Semitic peoples, do not have this cultural experience of art and statuary as the Greeks and Romans did. So we can say that the first blossoming of Christian art came as a kind of baptism and transformation of what was an instinctive cultural orientation among the Greek and Roman Christians. But it was not simply, as some would try to claim who reject Christian art, it was not simply a continuation of paganism. Rather, it was a completely new expression. So, the first problem of having emperors that come from the Semitic East, as these Isaurians and Armenians did, they had no experience of this rich iconography of the church, so that when they came to Constantinople, it was foreign to them. That's the first problem. The second problem is that they were particularly concerned with the threat of Islam. And of course, it's at this time that the Greek Christians begin to regard themselves as the East. They distance themselves more and more from the rest of the Mediterranean world, Rome and what's west, and vice versa. The Western Mediterranean world is gradually giving up on any kind of place of the Constantinopolitan emperor in their day-by-day life, and is pretty soon going to make an emperor of their own. So now we really begin to have the East and the West. And these new emperors want to, as much as possible, make peace with Islam. Now, one of what is central to Islam is this rejection of any use of images in perhaps an even more basic way than many of the Jews themselves. They regarded the Christians' use of iconography as idolatrous. So, this new generation of emperors thought that either toning down or completely eliminating a practice that was foreign to them anyway, you see, would be politically expedient for them on all sides. So that's one of the basic motivations behind the iconoclastic emperors. The other thing is that there are some theologians during this time in the 8th century who articulate an iconoclastic theology. They try to have a theological justification for the rejection of the use of images in the church. And this iconoclastic theology is quite a clever one, quite well worded. And these are its principal points. First of all, as one would imagine, and one can still hear in not a few non-Orthodox Christian sources, they refer to the second commandment that forbids the making of graven images. Then, in addition to that, they say that, and the whole iconoclastic war is focused primarily on the icon of Christ, you see. Icons of the saints and of the Mother of God kind of go along with it, but the whole point is, can we make an image of Christ? And the claim of the iconoclastic theologians is that if you make an image, if you make a material image of Christ, you are in fact reverting to one of the old heresies. Which one? Nestorianism. What does Nestorianism do? The union, as we said, between the divinity and humanity of Christ is so loose in Nestorius that Christ is presented as being basically two people, a divine person and a human person, and it's not clear how those two are joined. And the iconoclasts said, well, divinity cannot be pictured. Divinity is ineffable, unknowable, cannot be imaged in any way. So therefore, it's impossible to say that an icon of Christ portrays his divinity. But if you say, well, then the icon of Christ portrays his humanity, you are dividing the divinity and humanity in Jesus. You are therefore Nestorians, they said. So that was another claim of the iconoclasts. Then another claim they made is that they said there is only one icon of Christ, and the icon of Christ is the Holy Eucharist. They said that only the Holy Eucharist is the image of Christ. Now, what that is saying is that if the Holy Eucharist, which the iconoclasts believed was the body and blood of Christ, is the body and blood of Christ, if the Holy Eucharist is to be spoken of as an image of Christ, that means that the image of someone and the someone of whom that image is of are identical. Because no one denied at this time in the church that what was present in the Holy Eucharist was the actual body and blood of Christ. The same body born of Mary that died on the cross that rose from the dead. That is what is present in the Eucharist. So if we speak, as the iconoclasts did, of the Eucharist as the image of Christ, that means that an image of something and the something of which it is the image are the same. In other words, to use the philosophical language, the image is identical to the prototype. The prototype is the source of the image, and the image is identical to it. So they say, the iconoclast said, that if you make artistic visual images of Christ, you are saying, therefore, that those images are somehow Christ. And since Christ is God, you are worshiping a piece of wood and paint as an idol, treating it as God. So that was the argument of the iconoclasts. Now, who believed that? Relatively few. The presence of icons in the churches had been there for centuries and was taken for granted. And it depended on who the emperor was, how far these edicts about the icons were enforced. Some of them insisted that the icons be completely destroyed. And if one goes, for example, to ancient churches, for example, in the city of Thessalonica, you can see icons that have been destroyed by the iconoclasts, defaced. Some said, well, you don't have to get rid of them, you just have to stop kissing them. So they said they have to be put high up enough in the church so nobody can kiss them. Now, To the other extreme, there was going on among some Christians a veneration of icons that could be described as excessive, that did border on a kind of superstitious idolatry. Was not sanctioned by the use of the church, but as anything in the church can be abused. There are, in fact, some of the canons of the church that speak of how the Holy Eucharist itself is to be protected. It was to guard it against people using it not as the food and drink that the Lord gives to his people, but as a kind of superstitious amulet that gave you power. One of the reasons why the method of giving communion came to be changed throughout the whole church, both East and West, was to make sure that the people, when they were given communion, were actually eating the Holy Eucharist and not taking it with them to use for some sort of superstitious purpose. So that's why things like the spoon begin to be used, or putting the consecrated body of the Lord directly into the mouth, rather than entrusting it into the person's hands. You see, there was a desire of the church to safeguard the Eucharist against superstitious usage. Well, likewise, some people were doing very weird things with icons. They were scraping little bits of paint off of them and drinking it and treating it like it was kind of Holy Communion. Now, how much this was going on is not clear, but it was going on to a certain extent, and treating the icons as if they had a kind of inherent power of their own, in the way that people throughout the history of human culture have tended to treat special objects of veneration.